once you're a partner, the pressure still comes from other partners who are more senior, from senior partners, even when you're a senior partner, from other senior partners who are even more senior. And then in the end, if the partner isn't the one, then there's still the client. So in the end, it never really changes, right? You're always on constant alert because even as a senior partner, if your phone rings on a Saturday evening at 10 p.m. and it's your CEO client, you're going to pick up.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, Sierra founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave. Hey, Philip, excited to have you on the show.
Jeremy, it's a pleasure. It's been a while.
Yeah, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Philipp or Phil, originally German, grew up in China and Singapore. Nowadays, live in Southeast Asia, have been there for 3 years. Built a company called Tyger Brands together with my co-founder, Tim Michael. We originally started out as a house of brands focusing on a few different things and have for the last 2 years been focusing on building up the leading pet supplies ecosystem for the region. Our main brand is called Dr. Shiba, focused on dog supplies. We also have a cat brand called Professor Bengal and initially launched in the Philippines, nowadays also available in Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, and very recently launched in the UK. And that's my main gig.
Fantastic. So, let's go back to the beginning. What was your childhood like?
I think it was a fairly uncommon one, to be honest. So I mentioned earlier that I am German. Both my parents are German, but they met in China in the early 80s. They were both working for a German NGO doing development aid, both in the education sector. My dad was working on development aid for teachers' education together with the Chinese government. And my mother was actually a German teacher for Chinese university students in Hangzhou. And they met back then in, I think, 83. And yeah, that's kind of how I came about. So for me, that meant I was born in Germany. I was born in Munich, but when I was less than a year old, my parents decided to move us back to Shanghai. And I spent the first 5 or 6 years of my childhood there, went to an entirely Chinese kindergarten. I was the only foreigner. So I was really in a fully Chinese environment. I did learn German from my parents, but everyone else I spoke Chinese to, which is also why I think nowadays, very luckily for me, it's another mother tongue for me, Chinese, and has come in quite handy over the years. And yeah, when I was 6, we moved to Singapore and I did my entire primary school there. I did go to the German school in Singapore because otherwise I would probably have issues with my German nowadays. And then when I was 10, we moved to Germany. And then I spent most of my remaining childhood in Germany. It was quite the contrast moving from a multi-million inhabitant city like Singapore to a tiny village in Germany with back then less than 10,000 inhabitants. Luckily enough, somehow it worked for us. I have 2 younger sisters. Never really felt uprooted. The classic third culture kid issue luckily did not happen to me. Yeah, it did pull me back to China at some point when I was 16. I moved back to China with a non-profit exchange organization and did my 11th grade in Shenyang, a place close to North Korea. And yeah, did 1 year of classic Chinese high school, which was honestly incredibly tough for a lot of reasons. There were no foreigners in Shenyang at all. Everything was in Chinese. And I had actually forgotten my Chinese at that point. That was the main reason for me to go back. So a year earlier was the first time I went back to China. My younger sister is actually adopted from China. We wanted to show her where she's from. And I was incredibly frustrated because while as a child, Chinese was a mother tongue to me, I couldn't really communicate anymore. So I had decided the summer before that I would go back and try to regain my Chinese. And that was what I went to Shenyang for. Luckily, it all came back. It was just somewhere asleep. But the year was a very interesting one. Also, just because of, I think, environmental circumstances. It does get really cold up there. So it's like minus 30 degrees in winter. But that year shaped me a lot. Yeah. And then I did undergrad in Germany. Yeah.
So what was some good childhood memories, from, all those different countries?
I mean, there's a lot of them, very mixed ones. So I still remember my Chinese kindergarten quite well. And there's some funny pictures where you see me as the only white kid amongst all these Chinese children. I remember those times as really nice, fun, playful times. We were back then, it was very much restricted where foreigners were allowed to live. So we were actually living on the campus of a bigger school. There was housing on there. And I still remember there was a really nice front yard with a small fountain. And I would basically play there every day with other children. And then for us, I think summers were always one of the most exciting times for us that we look forward to, because my parents, my younger siblings, and I, we would always spend the summers in Germany at my grandfather's house, and the remaining parts of our family would join us. So my aunt with her children, my cousins, and we did this every single summer. So we're a fairly big family, but very closely knit because we would always spend 2 to 3 months together every summer. And yeah, those are really, really nice memories.
So there you are, all across the world, from China to Germany, and Singapore, and then you did your university in Germany. So what was your first job that you took? And obviously you were weighing different careers at that point in time, but how did you go about choosing your first full-time job?
So I went to this really small business school in Germany called WHU, which is more or less, I think, the school where most of the bigger entrepreneurs and also a lot of the classic consulting, investment banking folks used to come out of. Some of the more renowned people include the founders of Rocket Internet and their ventures. So back then, during school, there were a lot of events bringing us together with people from professional life right from the start. And a lot of these companies or even professions I had never heard of in my life, right? On a weekly basis, we had company presentations, I believe twice a week in the evenings. You could sign up for those. And then there would be a company presentation and there would be a nice dinner afterwards. You could network. And then, to be honest, I had never heard what management consulting was before studying, and I had no clue what it actually meant. But all of a sudden, everyone was talking about it and how exciting that was. And I think I was at that point more or less just was like, if everyone is talking about this, must be really cool. I almost, I don't know, got tracked into this whole thing. And as everyone, or more or less everyone else, was applying for their internships with McKinsey, BCG, and the likes, I followed suit. And yeah, did one or two consulting internships in the beginning. With Roland Berger, I did one in China, which brought me back to my other roots. And then I did one with BCG, and I kind of liked it. I thought it was exciting to work on very different projects in different geographies, different industries. And then, yeah, I had an offer to join BCG after undergrad, did a short stint afterwards in Cuba. I lived in Havana for 9 months. I wanted to go somewhere to learn Spanish, and then came back and decided against BCG for different reasons, ended up joining McKinsey because I did not know what I wanted to do. I think that was the main reason for me doing this whole consulting gig in the end. While some other friends had absolute clarity on what they wanted to do, I have one of my best childhood friends is a dentist. She always wanted to be a dentist. Her parents were dentists. I did not have that calling. I did not know what I wanted to do. So for me, consulting, at least that's how I explained it to myself, was a path where I would hopefully find out what I would like, or maybe at least find out what I wouldn't like. And yeah, that's how I ended up at McKinsey.
So what was the experience at McKinsey like? I mean, you spent a total of 8 years there in terms of chronological time. So what were some of the experiences and learnings there?
I think the beginning was quite tough. I think it's pretty normal for everyone. It is fast paced. Back then, it surely was still the days when working hours were also longer. The German office is also pretty well known for bad hours. So I think my first year was tough. And I remember even particularly my very first project was really tough, and it made me really consider quitting. I ended up not quitting, and as you said, I ended up staying for a long time. I think for me, one of the main things that I luckily managed to figure out probably after 9 months was that I had to get my lifestyle under control. And I started speaking up quite a bit for myself and also for the team, even though I was really, really junior. I joined after my undergrad with a bachelor's degree and was basically a junior analyst. But that ended up working out really well for me. So while a lot of other people, when there were edits to be done at, 11 p.m., they would say, sure, have it done by tomorrow morning. I started testing kind of the boundaries. And interestingly enough, that turned out to work quite well. And I think that actually earned me respect with some of the very senior people because they were really not used to this. So I still remember a conversation, for example, with a very senior partner was known to be kind of scary. And he at some point approached me when I think it was 6 or 7 months in, and he was like, "Hey, there's this project. You'll be a self-standing senior associate running this." And then he said the famous words, "It's a step up opportunity," which is when you're in consulting, that's when you start running. So it sounded absolutely terrible. I knew it was going to be a complete disaster if I was going to join this project. And there I was, this junior analyst with the senior partner, and I was just like, yeah, I'm not going to do it. And then he used very inappropriate words, something along the lines of, well, you either have blah, 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 or you don't. And I was like, well, then I don't have blah, 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 but I'm not going to do this project. And then I think most people would have thought that this was kind of the end of the working relationship with this guy, but it was the contrary. Actually, of course, in this moment, he wasn't happy about it. But looking back, that was probably one of the best decisions I ever took, because that really leveled the playing field for me. And this guy would call me a bunch of times after, and we did still work together a few times afterwards. And I think that's one thing that I'm glad I realized approximately 1 year in, because that completely changed my trajectory at McKinsey, and it made my whole life there much more sustainable. So while other people oftentimes ended up working crazy hours, I managed to be very selective about the projects and the teams, and usually ended up having fairly good lifestyle.
I empathize with that because, I was at Bain for 2 years. And after 2 years, I was very much like, I would like to build something of my own. And I had the opportunity. I think what's interesting is that, you did 8 years, and obviously you spent 2 to 3 of those years also going to Colombia, to university for your master's. Could you share a little bit more about some of your evolution of your thinking about whether to stay at McKinsey or what you're exploring during this time frame?
Yeah, so I think before doing my grad degrees, I wasn't even sure if I would stay for the 3 years that I had to stay until I was going to be able to go to grad school and get that pay. But then once I kind of managed to stay for those 3 years, I was like, I just don't want to pass on the opportunity of getting my graduate education paid for. And I was officially a part of the German office, of the Berlin office. But the 2 years before school, I was already doing most of my work in the US. And the German office had I think it still has, a very particular setup where you would only have to return to McKinsey for 1 year after your graduate degrees. And that was quite appealing to me. So I did that grad education and actually extended it. I started with an MBA, and then I saw other people doing this interesting international affairs public policy degree. And I was like, oh, I kind of want to do this as well. And then I got very lucky because they ended up being this dual degree, and I kind of managed to sell this to McKinsey. So they also paid for that one. And I was out for 3 years. And I honestly wasn't very excited about going back for that 1 year afterwards. I kind of like my school life. I'd been out for almost 3 years. And 1 year seemed short, and it flew by. And then I think the evolution of leaving, there was a bunch of different things. So one thing was that COVID actually hit, and I was one of the very first COVID patients in New York. I contracted COVID in end of February or beginning of March back then, and was quarantined in a hotel room in the city for 3 weeks, which was not a lot of fun because hotel rooms in New York are not very big. And then ended up having to leave the US, came back to Germany, had to crash at my parents' place. And then I unfortunately developed a very, very strong version of long COVID, which eventually put me on medical leave for half a year. And that really shifted my perspective on everything. Aside from the fact that I never really wanted to be a McKinsey partner because I didn't really like seeing how these McKinsey partner lives apparently are still flying around all the time, not being the decision maker, but only being the advisor. But then also me being sick made me really rethink what I wanted and also what I did not want. And yeah, then in the end, when I decided to leave, it was honestly a very easy decision. I always thought it would be super hard because, of course, McKinsey is a little bit like a golden cage. You know exactly how things are going to play out. You know what you need to deliver. It's just so planned. But I at that point, I was very clear that I didn't want it anymore. And then the decision to leave was very easy for me. And I was very lucky because a few months before I fully took that decision, friends of mine approached me and asked me whether I wanted to join a new venture startup in Southeast Asia. And the idea back then was to build a house of consumer brands. So basically an evolution of the FBA aggregation game. Instead of buying brands, building them rapidly, scaling them. And I kind of like the idea because this playbook has been done a few times. I also like the geography. As much as I had spent a lot of time in Germany and the US, the previous 10 years, I was ready for a change. And I like the idea of going back to Asia where also spent significant parts of my childhood. So we started working on this while I was still at McKinsey, and it started to become more and more interesting. And I started seeing a path for this being a real thing, being a full-time thing, and then started raising money, angel money, found really good angels, kind of managed to fully raise the round, and then decided to leave. Um, yeah. So that was kind of the evolution.
I would like to actually, kind of like break that up into three parts, right? I think one is obviously experience of long COVID, two, your
Mm.
decision regarding, whether to go to be a McKinsey partner, and because I think it's not very clear to everybody. And number three, of course, is your decision around building a company in Southeast Asia. So let's go through part one, which is what was your experience getting COVID, and more importantly, long COVID as one of the first few patients in New York?
Yeah, I think that was probably the toughest time of my life, to be honest, because at some point I really didn't know if I was still going to live or what kind of life I would still live, just because I was really not in a good place health-wise. And I think that really triggered this internal discussion in me on what I want to spend time on in my life and what I don't want to spend time on.
What was maybe more specifically, like, you were going through long COVID? What was that experience like? Were you in bed? Were you tired? What was that experience actually? How were you trying to recover during that period of time? Because it was a scary time that people didn't know what COVID was. People didn't
Yeah.
know what long COVID was. The internet was full of theories and rebuttals. So what was that experience for you personally?
So I started developing a lot of heart-related symptoms. My heart would just pound out of nowhere, which was very, very scary. I started having this tachycardia, which then, of course, led to also some kind of level of anxiety. At the same time, my just physical state was quite impacted. I had lost all of my cardio fitness and was quite scared of rebuilding it because my heart was doing all these strange things. So yeah, my life was really impacted. I was not in bed. I was not bedridden. But I did feel like, I didn't know if I was ever going to be able to do normal things again at full scale
Yeah.
for quite some time.
How did you feel that? Was that like grief? Was it sadness? Was it fear? Was it anxiety? I mean, I was kind of curious how you were processing those emotions
It was
at that
mostly
time. Yeah.
fear, to be honest. Fear of, because I also didn't really know what the problem was. As you said, COVID was not well understood, and people basically, or doctors, couldn't really tell me what exactly the problem is, and also what exactly the or a recovery path could look like. And I think that was the scariest thing, the uncertainty, because I think it's always easier to live with or address a problem if you know what exactly the problem is. If there's a lot of this uncertainty, it just makes it really hard. At least it was for me. Yeah.
So what's interesting is that you were having these heart issues, you were on medical leave, and you started doing some of that processing about your life. What were some of the reflections that you had about your life at that point of time?
I think one thing that was pretty clear to me was that I did not want to spend 11:30 p.m. evenings sitting in a corner office somewhere in the middle of nowhere doing advisory work for a company that in the end might do something completely different than what we would advise, right? I think that became very clear to me. So it was, I think, very much a revelation to me that I wanted to do much less things that I didn't really enjoy and maximize just what I actually enjoy doing, what I enjoy spending time on, people I enjoy. And actually, I love the people at McKinsey. Don't get me wrong. That's not a good point. But there were, especially in the last 2 years at McKinsey, a lot of times situations in which I had to do things that I very much disagreed with because I either thought they were unnecessary or I thought it was the wrong decision. But I was not a decision maker and I kind of had to live with it. And I started to feel this inner struggle more and more during that time. And I think before my graduate degrees, I could kind of live with it. And I could just power through. And even if I questioned something, I kind of could get myself to do it. I started feeling like really my inner body rebel. Like I sometimes had to do things and I physically felt, it wasn't really anger, but I had to force myself and it just didn't feel good at all. And that started happening more and more. I was like, I just don't want to be in that situation anymore.
Yeah. And I think it's actually something that I empathize with because I also had those hours and so forth. And one interesting piece is, I think there's a bit of dissonance between what people view, I think, the partnership at McKinsey BCG versus, I think, what you and I saw from the inside, right? So could you share a little bit more, like, because I'm sure you saw that for yourself, right? Like before you entered McKinsey, you saw the partners live. versus the actual reality. Could you share a little bit more about what that difference was from your perspective?
I mean, I think from the outside, the key thing that you don't see is really how much work and pressure there is all the time. And that just never really changes. I think no matter what seniority level you are, there always is this pressure. And McKinsey and the likes do this incredibly well because a lot of this pressure is self-generated because technically you don't compete against anyone else, right? You compete against yourself. You get rated against certain standards. There's not a certain number of people that can pass. You compete against yourself. But somehow all these top consulting firms manage to build a system in which people go above and beyond, right? It's this constant pressure, leveraging insecure overachievers. And I think in the beginning, the pressure comes maybe more from the more senior managers. But then once you're a partner, the pressure still comes from other partners who are more senior, from senior partners, even when you're a senior partner, from other senior partners who are even more senior. And then in the end, if the partner isn't the one, then there's still the client. So in the end, it never really changes, right? You're always on constant alert because even as a senior partner, if your phone rings on a Saturday evening at 10 p.m. and it's your CEO client, you're going to pick up. So I think that is something that I started seeing much more also happening because I was, of course, there during the week and saw these people. And also just the constant running around. And I used to love flying. I felt so cool on these business trips. But at some point, I also was like, I mean, these people are insane. They go there Monday here, Tuesday there. I remember there was a senior partner in the Berlin office who would sometimes fly to South Africa from Germany on a Monday, fly back, and then fly there one more time on a Thursday. It was just a lot of this like nonsensical stuff. And I mean, nowadays people, I think, wouldn't do that anymore. But yeah, people were just, they were cutting short their lives. I think both in terms of actual time available in that very moment, they were not at home, right? They were constantly on the road. And then people are like, okay, I have no problem to work until midnight because I'm somewhere where I don't know anyone anyway. But then also cutting short their remaining lifespan, right? Because there's no way of working these crazy hours, being on a plane all the time for years without having an impact longer term. So I think a lot of the charm was just really not there for me anymore. And also, I think the last point on this, the upside. I mean, of course, you're going to have a very good life financially as a McKinsey partner, a senior partner, or in a comparable role. But it's also not like an immense upside, right? You kind of know what's going to happen and what you can maybe make, but you always have to work for this. It's never going to change. While compared to entrepreneurship, of course, risk reward is completely different, right? There's a high likelihood that it's not going to work. But then, of course, the reward side is also a completely different one. Yeah.
And that's interesting because it ties directly to what you did, which is that you chose to make the bet to build this company. And yeah, you're building on the side. You decided to double down, but it's a new geography in a sense of Southeast Asia, right? In terms of building a business, you previously were consulting across New York and Europe. What was it like transitioning to Southeast Asia, house of brands, startup, founder mindset? Those are, like a triple jump, right? In that sense, right? A change in geography, a change in role, and frankly, a change in industry as well. So how was that transition like?
I mean, it was a complete transition as you described it. I think also just the way of working, moving from effectively drawing slide decks back then to executing, raising money. I'd never raised money in my life before, right? And I was the one who took charge of that. Finally activating the network that I had built over the previous 10 or 15 years. It was super exciting. At the same time, it was also pretty scary because it ended up changing. It wasn't entirely clear what we would do. We of course, didn't really know if it was going to work out. And we had a lot of issues in the beginning. We unfortunately also had quite some issues in the founding team. It's something I'm not going to get into details today, but we were originally 4 co-founders and then eventually ended up being 2. So there was a lot of turmoil that we had to navigate. One thing that surprisingly enough worked quite well for me, one of the worries I always had was that I was going to weigh way too much what to do and wouldn't be able to get into execution mode. And I think I really tried to make a point of not falling into this trap because I know a lot of consultants tend to have this overanalyzing. So I think one of the things that I forced myself into, also had my co-founder hold me accountable to, was really that we started executing and just iterating quickly. But of course, it was a very, very different type of work. It was not glamorous at all. I mean, we basically did not draw a salary. I think, we actually didn't draw a salary, or a completely marginal salary. We started this out of Manila. A co-founder was living in this apartment in BGC. I rented a very small apartment on a different floor. We obviously did not have an office. Our first office was downstairs. There was this coffee shop called Shaka in BGC, great vegan coffee shop, and that was our office. So nowadays, when we go back, people still know this was Phil's and Tim's first office where it all started from. But yeah, it was quite the change compared to the McKinsey glamorous life, I have to say.
I think that's fascinating, right? Because we're talking about the difference between the consulting versus the founder. And you talked about one thing that you had to let go, right? Which was changing from making slides to executing. Could you talk about what things were helpful from the consulting that ported well to the founder life versus what were the things that you said you had to intentionally change in order to succeed in the founder mindset?
Yeah, I think so. One very general point, I had thought about building a startup also before business school, and I just didn't feel ready. So one of the things on a more generic level was that I felt ready. Of course, I did not know what I had to expect, but I felt much more ready just given the additional work experience I had. I think if we look at specific things, so things that certainly helped me from consulting was the ability to structure and dissect bigger problems into smaller ones. I think some of the other things include also being able to find very clear and purpose intent based messaging for the right audiences. So when talking to potential investors, finding the right way to pitch, building, of course, the pitch deck, but also when talking to potential customers. I think one big thing also on the HR side, once we started building a team, kind of leveraging what I learned on performance management, right? I think McKinsey has, also BCG and so on, have a very well-working performance and review system. So a lot of these things I could apply to the way we run our company. I think the key thing on what maybe really wasn't ideal, but that's kind of the point that I made in the beginning, was that McKinsey really was a lot of analysis all the time, right? It was a lot of analysis, a lot of if scenarios, a lot of scenario planning. And I think the key difference was, of course, you would also want to think about different scenarios in a startup, but you would want to like maximally shorten that time of thinking and then maximize really the trying out time and the iteration. And this was, I think, a key difference. Yeah.
I find that super fascinating, right? Because I totally agree, right? Like there's analysis and then there's analysis paralysis and then there's founder life where you don't have time to do even analysis. You just have to do it, I'm just kind of curious, how did you change your mindset? Was it just like, I don't know, reality? Was it books? Was it your co-founder? How did you kind of like push yourself through this transition?
I honestly cannot tell you. I think it was just reality, to be honest. It was not books. It certainly wasn't. I love books. I read a lot of books. It definitely was not books. I'm not sure if you can learn entrepreneurship from books. I think it was the reality, just getting hit by so many different issues at the same time, sorting out regulatory issues, sorting out funding, sorting out burning cash. Like it just hits you, right? And then you start, at least for me, it was just sorting through the different issues and trying to tackle them one by one. I think just the sheer number of issues that you kind of knew was going to await you the next morning every single day kind of got me into a mode of execution. So it naturally happened. I wouldn't be able to tell you what specifically I did.
And what's interesting is that, you came out with also a product market fit iteration. And that's why I met you, right? Because you were very much in the early days pitching the House of Brands. We had a bit of a debate about House of Brands, aggregators. And I think the logic point that we had was like, what happens if a brand succeeds? And was that a repeatable skill set of innovating new consumer brands? And I think that was our debate that we had at that point of time. And I'm just kind of curious, like, how did you go about that product market fit iteration?
One thing is pure time constraint, to be honest. So we started with 3 brands. We don't have to talk about the other 2. They were in very different areas. There was a coffee brand, there was a natural cosmetics brand, and what is nowadays Dr. Shiba, Prof. Bengal, and then there's also Dr. Akita nowadays. And in the beginning, we kind of managed to set all things up and push them slowly. I had the belief that we would, from an organizational standpoint, be able to maintain and push all 3 of these. And I think that was a flawed view, to be honest, looking back. Part of the issue was that once these brands, and especially Dr. Shiba, started to scale, there were just so many additional issues and things that had to be solved, right, to make sure that it would grow further. I think the other thing that probably was specific to our case was that we changed our direction quite a bit during the time also when we spoke. We were originally planning to really go down the VC road, raise quite a bit of money, try to build the next unicorn. And we really changed our thesis on this once we had these first conversations. And I think both Tim and myself started seeing a lot of appeal in doing more of a semi-bootstrapping route and not following the VC route. And that's the route that we ended up taking. And I think that is one of the best decisions looking back that we took building Tyger Brands. But that obviously also had an impact on how big the team could be, for example, right? So we had to be quite careful in hiring decisions, in personnel spend. And I just think we would not have been able to finance a really fully capable, sizable team to maintain and grow 3 brands. So once Dr. Shiba started taking off and we started seeing very good early signals, we were just like, okay, let's double down on the winning horse and see what happens. And then it kind of was a gift that kept on giving. And Dr. Shiba just started, continued growing like crazy. And at some point, just from a pure resource perspective, almost all resources were focused on Dr. Shiba, and the other 2 brands just started being much more of a afterthought. Probably, I don't even know, 6-9 months later, looking at our revenues, it was just all of a sudden like, okay, there's Dr. Shiba. And then like somewhere down there, there's the other 2 brands. Like, why would I even still spend any time on those? So that kind of just naturally happened. We honestly I think we never actually took a very active decision where we stood in front of all of our team members and said, hey, starting tomorrow, the only thing we're all going to do is Dr. Shiba. We're not going to touch the other 2 brands anymore. It was really much more evolutionary. We just started shifting everything towards Dr. Shiba. And then technically these 2 brands still exist. You will still find them. We still sell some stuff, but no one really does anything with them. Yeah.
I think it is interesting to see how you've pivoted, especially because, Amazon brand aggregators, as you shared at 2021, 2022 was super hot. And I think it made sense that theoretically there was a way to build multiple brands, but from an entrepreneurial bottom-up perspective, it was better to prioritize. From your perspective as a result, could you share a personal story about a time that you've been brave?
Yeah. I mean, I think braveness is oftentimes also measured by what other people think is brave. I think for me, one of the things that was indeed very brave was doing this move to China when I was 16. I did not know where I would be sent back then because it was a not-for-profit. So the way it worked was that you had to apply for the program. In theory, you were supposed to choose multiple countries. And I basically put all my money on one bet, which was only putting China, which already reduced my chances, but somehow that worked out. But then I did not know where in China I would be sent. And I had no influence over this. And little did I know that they kind of changed their plans, because in the previous years, everyone was sent to either Beijing or Shanghai. So 2 big cities, also back then, 2006, fairly developed. But in that specific intake that I was a part of, they decided to try out some new places. And we then learned that there was a bunch of smaller cities, but definitely the most unknown and kind of off the grid location was Shenyang. And out of the, I think, 20 people or 30 people that we were from all over the globe who were sent to China, everyone was like, okay, I really hope I don't get sent to Shenyang. I hope I don't. So I remember I received this letter one day where we kind of get our host family assigned. Of course, I was the one who was sent to Shenyang. And honestly, that was pretty shocking because nowadays, of course, it's a little bit different. Shenyang is a fairly developed industrial city, but back then, most people had never heard of Shenyang. Of course, back then, it was also already a multi-million city. BMW actually already had a plant there, but it was really off the grid. It is fairly close to North Korea, as I mentioned. It was an entirely industrial production focused city with really bad smog as well. Pollution was really bad and there were no foreigners. So I ended up going there. And as I mentioned earlier, I had forgotten my Chinese, right? And that was a key issue in this whole equation because while in Beijing and Shanghai, maybe there were still some people who would know some English, it was abundantly clear to me that that would absolutely not be the case in Shenyang. So I think we had a month of prep or so in Beijing altogether, a little bit of language classes. And then luckily enough, after that 1 month, my Chinese started slowly coming back. But still, it was very rudimentary. I mean, I left China when I was 6, so I had the vocabulary of a 6-year-old. Luckily, no problems with grammar and so on. But still, I was 16. So topics were slightly different compared to when I was a 6-year-old child. And then, I mean, this 1 year really brought a lot of challenges with itself. I was, I think, 1 out of only 3 out of the 30 people who went to China who did not switch their host family once. So I stayed with my host family the entire time through, thick and thin. It was challenging both from an external standpoint. Just, I mentioned the winters earlier, it was minus 30 degrees. It took me 2 hours one way to get to school on multiple buses in the dark, oftentimes standing in the cold. So I think just from an external standpoint, it was incredibly tough. But also for me as a 16-year-old teenager, right? Being in an unfamiliar environment where people did not speak my language initially. Yeah, so that was actually probably one of the bravest things I've ever done. I managed to power through, and I'm very thankful that I did this looking back. It very much, I think, shaped who I am today, also in terms of resilience and keeping on going even when it's tough. Yeah, and I think that the cool thing is I still have a very good relationship with my host family. I actually just went to China, I think 3 or 4 months ago, to attend my host brother's wedding. That was a brave moment of mine.
Wow, I'm crazy. Yeah, time flies, and I would love to see those photos of you at your host brother's wedding. It sounds like quite a blast, especially because there's some sort of like visual comparison between both when you're younger versus now, I guess, married and happy. On that note, I'd love to kind of like summarize the 3 big takeaways I got from the conversation. First of all, thanks so much for sharing about your global childhood and teenage years. And, I think there's such a cosmopolitan or international globe trotting from a, location perspective, but really fantastic to hear the internal monologue and the resilience and the lessons that you took away from that international set experiences across Germany, China, Singapore, New York, right? And, circling across these areas as well. That's one. Two, thanks so much for sharing about your experience in consulting. I think it was just great to hear, I think, insider's perspective on, like you said, the gold standard consulting company. And I think this is a certain view from the outside versus the view from the inside. And, it was fantastic for you to hear about how consulting can be the right role for some people. It's just that it wasn't the right role for you. And I think it was very illuminating for you to share it from your perspective and more importantly, how you reached that conclusion over time. Lastly, thanks so much for sharing about your transition to founder life, about what lessons worked and what things you had to unlearn in order to become a founder. And I think it was great to hear about how you also iterated on your product market fit, your approach to the market. Also, in parallel, also had to rethink about whether you wanted to raise venture capital and instead decided to bootstrap instead. So thank you so much for such an illuminating set of insights.
Thank you for having me. This was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.